I like that the jury was able to ask questions as well. Okay. 9 a.m., the court was in session. After 17 days of witness testimony and evidence being presented, the jury will hear from both the prosecution and defense. Special Judge Francis Gull told the jury Wednesday they would hear several hours of closing arguments. The judge told each side they would have up to 2.5 hours. Both sides will only be able to talk about the evidence and testimony that was admitted during the trial, which means the defense team will not be allowed to bring up Odinism or any of the third-party suspects they claim actually committed the murders. When closing arguments are over, the jury will be given instructions. If they have reasonable doubt, they are instructed to find Richard Allen not guilty. If they believe Allen committed the murders, they are instructed to find him guilty. After that, it will be up to the jury. Deliberations could take hours or days. The 12-member jury, 3 alternates excluded, must reach a unanimous verdict. If they are unable to do so, the trial could end in a mistrial. Before court begins, News 8's Kyla Russell reports that defense attorney Andrew Baldwin writes Rick on a coffee cup and gives it to Allen. Normally, Allen gets a coffee from the courthouse, but today Baldwin has purchased one from a local shop. At 8:47 a.m., Allen enters the room. Russell reports that he has a regular large-size Bible today, and not the typical Gideon-style Bible he's had in the past. He is heard saying he loves the coffee. He shows defense attorney Jennifer Oger a verse in his Bible. Prosecutor Stacy Diener is seen hugging the German and William family members. Abby's mother is crying and being comforted by family. At 9:04 a.m., Judge Gull enters the courtroom. The jury enters at 9:07. Court is in session. Gull says the jury again had supervised contact with their electronic devices. She explains some of the case-specific jury instructions. 1, the jury must follow all law while deliberating. 2, the jury must consider all facts. Gull reads all the counts against Allen. He shakes his head as Gull reads charges that say he killed AW and LG. She explains the concept of beyond reasonable doubt and the definition of murder. Gull explains that if the state proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Allen killed the girls, they must find him guilty and vice versa. Gull explains intentionally what it means. Now we move into the prosecutor. 9:17 a.m. Prosecutor Nick McClellan begins closing arguments. He tells the jury that February 13th is a day Delphi will never forget. He says the state has proven that Allen is the bridge guy. He tells the jury, quote, the state has done just that. McClellan talks about the day, where Libby was the last time she talked to Becky Patty, Libby's grandmother. He is showing the jury a PowerPoint with Libby and Abby's Snapchat photo from Kelsey German's car. He recounts the search Libby's father made and how he called Becky Patty. McClellan tells the jury about the search and that Brad Weber, the neighbors, let them look around his property. He says he did not look through the house at that time, however. McClellan goes through the testimony of several people on the bridge and in the area that saw Bridge Guy, from Betsy Blair, who saw the girls, to Sarah Carbaugh, who said she saw Bridge Guy, quote, muddy and bloody. He says, quote, that doesn't happen around here, referring to the murders. He describes the bodies being found and shows photos of the girls' clothes in Deer Creek. He describes the crime scene being secured. McClellan shows the jury a photo of Libby's phone. He shows the Bridge Guy video from February 13th, 2017 at 2:13. He says, quote, the video shows the moment they were forced down the hill by the guy in the video, Bridge Guy. He forced them down the hill with a gun. He says Libby said in the video, that be a gun. He shows the jury an enhanced version of the Bridge Guy video. McClellan says law enforcement interviewed people on the bridge that day. He shows a photo of a witness took of Freedom Bridge. He recounts Bree Wilbur saying she saw a man on the trails, quote, walking with purpose. He shows the jury Betsy Blair's Fitbit information. He talks about Sarah Carbaugh seeing a man muddy and bloody on 300 North. McClellan talks about Chris Cecil's forensic examination of Libby's phone and how he got health data from it. He says that data confirms when the girls were at the bridge. He says GPS shows when movement was at 2:32 p.m. and that there was no more movement after that. He goes over the timeline with witnesses, when they arrived, when they went. He says Breanne Wilbur arrived at Freedom Bridge at 12:25 p.m. that day and walked to the high bridge. She took a photo at 1:26 p.m. at the bridge. He says she ran into Bridge Guy while walking back to Freedom Bridge. McClellan tells the jury about Betsy Blair passing a camera at the Hoosier Harvest Store, heading to the high bridge. He says Kelsey German's car was also seen on that camera, passing it after she dropped off the girls. He says Blair saw a man on the bridge and passed Libby and Abby as they arrived on the bridge. He says Bridge Guy video was taken at 2:13 p.m. He tells the jury Libby's phone stopped moving at 2:32 p.m. He says that Sarah Carbaugh passed the Hoover Harvest Store at 3:56 p.m. and she saw Bridge Guy and he was muddy and bloody. McClellan says, quote, if we can determine who Bridge Guy is, we can determine who killed Abby Williams and Liberty German. McClellan moves ahead to 2022. He describes Kathy Shank finding the lead sheet regarding Allen. He describes Shank taking the tip to Tony Liggett, a detective working on the investigation. He describes conservation officer Dan Doolin downloading a photo of Allen from the BMV. McClellan says it was determined that Allen's car was the only 2016 black Ford Focus registered in Carroll County in 2017. He says former Sheriff Steve Mullen went to the Hoosier Harvest Store and got footage from the camera there of Allen's Ford Focus at 1:17 p.m. He says that on October 13th, 2022, Mullen called Allen in for an interview. He says Allen confirmed that we was wearing... What? He says Allen confirmed he was wearing the same clothes Bridge Guy was wearing. McClellan tells the jury that Allen said he saw 3 girls, but in the interview he changed the time he was there. He said Allen became angrier as the interview went on. He shows the jury photos of Allen's Ford Focus in the garage during the search of Allen's home. He says they found the blue Carhartt jacket in Allen's home. McClellan says, quote, surprise, surprise. I got to stop here for a second. If they have the actual coat, were they not able to get any DNA or any kind of evidence from his actual coat? And he says, surprise, surprise. McClellan says they found the 6 Sauer 40 caliber handgun and cartridges that were the same brand and caliber as the cartridge found at the crime scene. McClellan calls it a, quote, Bridge Guy starter kit. He says they found a memories box, and that box contained a 40 caliber cartridge. He says investigators found many electronic devices, but not the phone Allen used in 2017. McClellan tells the jury that Allen searched Should I Die Now? After looking at Delphi News in April of 2022. He tells the jury that Melissa Oberg found the cartridge at the scene, cycled through Allen's handgun, and her work was verified. He says Allen confirmed in an October 26, 2022 interview that he never loaded his gun or that he never lent his gun or clothes out to anyone. He said Allen confirmed he did not loan anyone ammunition. McClellan says, quote, there's no explanation for how his bullet ended up there. He says Allen's wife, Kathy, was brought in for questioning, and during the interview, Allen manipulated her. McClellan says Allen was arrested because he is Bridge Guy. McClellan talks about calls Allen made in prison to his mother and wife. He describes a call Allen had with his mom where he says he had found faith. He plays a call with Allen's wife where Allen says, quote, I killed Abby and Libby. His wife says, no, you didn't, dear. They are screwing with you, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of it. He shows the confession letter Alan wrote to the warden. He shows the report from Dr. Walla on April 5th, 2023, where Alan said his intentions were, quote, sexual in nature. News 8's Kyla Russell reports Alan is shaking his head during this. McClellan tells the jury that Walla said Alan's behavior changed after his attorneys visited and that the shift in his behavior was intentional and he was not psychotic. McClellan read multiple confessions made by Alan in prison, including one Alan made about using a box cutter to kill the girls. McClellan says Alan told his mother in May of 2023 that, quote, I wouldn't sit here and tell you I did it if I didn't. He talks about another confession that Alan made in January of 2024, after he had been moved out of the Westfield Correctional Unit. McClellan describes Brian Harshman, the officer who read Walla's reports and listened to Alan's phone calls. He describes Harshman discovering the detail about the white van Alan said he saw while committing the crimes. He said Harshman verified the owner of that van in 2017. He tells the jury that the owner of that van, Brad Weber, did drive it that day. He points to Alan and says, quote, something only the killer would know. Alan raises his eyebrows. McClellan says Harshman knew it was the same voice as Bridge Guy and all the calls he's listened to from Alan. McClellan shows the jury all the charges, which include charges for felony murder for killing Libby and Abby. He tells the jury, quote, now the pieces come together. McClellan says Bridge Guy, quote, stole the youth and life from Libby and Abby. He shows the Snapchat photo from Kelsey German's car again. He says something in Libby caused her to begin recording on her phone. He tells the jury that there was a pause in the health data on Libby's phone before Alan killed the girls. He says, quote, grabbing for her throat, struggling to stay alive, she begins to cry. He says Alan lived in the community for 5 years, but didn't know he left a cartridge at the scene. McClellan reviews 3 points. 1, Bridge Guy. 2, bullet. 3, confessions. Quote, I believe the evidence is firmly convincing that Richard Allen is Bridge Guy and he killed Abby and Libby, McClellan told the jury. After 58 minutes, McClellan finished. Now to the defense. Rozzi tells the jury they've been there for almost a month and have seen 17 days of evidence. Quote, the defense trusts what you've heard over the last several weeks. Rozzi says there are 4 main themes. 1, broken timeline. 2, bumbled ballistics. 3, false confessions. 4, digital forensics. Rozzi tells the jury that the state has presented a theme of, quote, what they don't want you to hear is what we had to tell you. He says, quote, we had to do their job, end quote. Rozzi expands on that by saying that the state refused to have height analysis done on Bridge Guy. He says hours of video interviews from 2017 were lost. Rozzi tells the jury the state had to look at a detail about the Ford Focus before doing a BMV search in the middle of the trial after a juror asked about it. He said the juror asked if it was the only 2016 black Ford Focus registered in 2017. Rozzi begins to describe witness testimony, saying that Brad Heath said he saw an unusual man that day. He said the Betsy Blair testimony didn't tell the whole story. Rozzi says, quote, I have to take a breath before I talk about here. When referring to Sarah Carbaugh, he says Carbaugh conflated muddy with bloody. He tells the jury they may discount a witness, calling it credible dubiosity. He says the jury that they can discredit Carbaugh. Rozzi says the prosecution did not tell them about David McCain, Shelby Hicks, or Cheyenne Mill. because it, quote, doesn't fit their narrative. Rozzi tells the jury the prosecution didn't include Alan's timeline regarding how he got to the bridge. Alan nods his head in agreement in the courtroom. Rozzi suggests to the jury that they should use two pieces of evidence to exercise common sense. The two interviews from October 13th and 2020 and 2022. Rozzi says that Brad Weber's gun could not be excluded as the one that cycled the cartridge found at the scene. Rozzi says Weber had sticks in his garage, and the state did not mention that. He brings up Weber's account changed from February 13th. Rozzi talks about phone calls on April 3rd, 2023, that the state didn't bring up at all. Rozzi says the state did not offer up information on the FBI leaving the investigation. He says the sticks laying on the bodies were not collected. Rozzi brings up the Westville videos of Alan. He says Alan was in solitary and without human interaction. He says the state only wants you to hear a few words. Rozzi says the magic bullet is the majority of the state's case. He says the state just wants the jury to believe Oberg and ignore the state not bringing up photos. Use your common sense, he says. Rozzi mentions Libby's phone being plugged into an accessory was not brought up by the state. He shows the jury a phone timeline. Quote, you should question their credibility, Rozzi says, referring to the prosecution. He says the state was desperate to make an arrest. Rozzi tells the jury that the Brad Weber van detail was only recently added this year. He says it took 7 years for the hair and DNA testing to occur. Rozzi says that Alan's Google searches have no proof that Alan actually made the searches. The searches are only registered to his email, he says. Rozzi says the Google search information was forensic examiner Chris Cecil offering the jury, quote, fast food. Rozzi tells the jury that the man who performed the autopsies on the girls, Dr. Roland Kaur, said in a deposition that there may have been more than one murder weapon, and now it says could be a box cutter. He says Kaur said this after the meeting with the prosecution 3 times. Rozzi tells the jury that they should consider that Carbaugh didn't see anything. He says the state only has a few key moments in their timeline. February 13th at 2:13 p.m., the Bridge Guy video. February 13th at 3:56 p.m., Carbaugh sees a man on 300 North. Rozzi calls Carbaugh's testimony worthless. He says Abby would have lived for 5 to 10 minutes and could have screamed, but nobody heard any screaming. Rozzi said the state ignored that there could have been more than one killer. He also says they ignored that someone could have accessed the bridge from the south side. He says the state suggests the crime was labor intensive and committed by a 5'5" man without a trace in a short period of time. Rozzi says, quote, it is just implausible. Rozzi tells the jury Alan went to law enforcement after the murders in 2017 and was also cooperative in 2022. He says Alan still cooperated after he knew he was a suspect. Rozzi says, quote, even through the face of lies, Alan stood strong. He says Alan lived in the community and didn't have a reason to leave because he didn't do it. Rozzi brings up the forensic examination Oberg did of the cartridge found at the scene. He says Oberg's testing did not show sufficient agreement between the cartridge that was found and the cartridge that was tested. He says the photos from the cartridge testing should be the main thing the jury is stressed by because there is an agreement. Rozzi says Oberg told them, you should just believe me. He says the state did not have the cartridge re-examined because Oberg's work was, quote, so horrid. He tells the jury that Alan's situation in this case is unprecedented, referring to Alan being in solitary confinement. He says Alan was treated like a convicted murderer. Alan nods in agreement in the courtroom. Rozzi tells the jury that Alan was, quote, immediately placed on suicide watch. Everyone would have a breakdown under those circumstances. He says Alan was in solitary confinement for 13 months. He asked, quote, "How much can one human endure?" Rozzi says it was insulting that the state did not want to see the jury to see the video of Alan in Westville. He says if Alan was not faking it, and even Dr. Walla and Dr. Martin said they weren't sure he was faking it. He says the Indiana Department of Corrections medical standard was to keep Alan alive. Rozzi tells the jury, quote, "You should be insulted." Rozzi says Alan was having false memories during some of the confessions. He says the state lied about Libby's phone. Rozzi says someone was using the phone between 5:45 p.m. and 10:32 p.m. on February 13th. He said someone plugged something into it during that time. He says there's no explanation because the phone is right. Rozzi tells the jury that there is no trace evidence that connects Alan to the crime scene. He said that Dr. Polly Westcott, a neuropsychologist, said that Dr. Walla's notes read more like a story, despite Alan being psychotic and not coherent. He says the state was desperate to make the sound in the bridge guy video the sound of a handgun racking. Rozzi tells the jury there is a question as to if the girls' bodies were at the scene during the evening on February 13th, 2017. He says the Smith & Wesson cartridge found in the memory box is a very common brand. Rozzi says Alan found God because he was in a cell alone with only a Bible, but that's not why he confessed. Rozzi tells the jury there are 5 components for the jury to keep in mind. 1, nobody identified Alan as bridge guy. 2, no digital data connects Alan to the crime. 3, no clothing connects Alan. 4, no DNA connects Alan. 5, no trace material connects Alan. Rozzi acknowledges the girls' families. He says this has been a long journey. Rozzi says, quote, "At the end of the day, the state's timeline has crumbled. The magic bullet is nothing more than a tragic bullet." Rozzi shows the jury a photo, a rack, a medieval torture device. He shows a photo of a thumb screw. He says these tools are not far from what Alan experienced in solitary. Rozzi says these tools are still used, they're just evolved. Rozzi shows 4 photos of Alan in prison. In the photos, he is covered in feces and being dragged while wearing a spit hood. News 8's Kyla Russell says while the photos are shown, Alan looks away. His wife, Kathy, is crying. Rozzi says, quote, "Rendering a verdict of guilt could be endorsing this behavior." Rozzi asks the jury to set Alan free. He is finished at 12 p.m. after speaking for an hour and 17 minutes. Sounds like pretty powerful closing statements, and now this case is in the jury's hands. What do you guys think is going to happen? Let me know. Let me know.